Good evening and welcome to this very special event. My name is Alexandra Walla. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Slavic, German, and Eurasian Studies. Tonight, we are truly honored to welcome a distinguished guest, Ambassador and Permanent Representative of Ukraine to the United Nations, His Excellency, Mr. Sergiy Kyslytsya. Before I introduce our esteemed guest, I would like to acknowledge the work of colleagues in a number of units across campus who made Ambassador Kyslytsya's visit possible and tonight's event possible. My home department of Slavic, German, and Eurasian Studies, first and foremost, as well as Kyiv's Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies. The two units worked together to organize the ambassador's visit. I want to thank my colleague, Erik Scott, for all his hard work in making this happen as well. A special word of thanks is due to the staff of both units, Wyatt Haywood, Ezra Predolets, and Megan Luttrell, as well as some of our graduate students who took care of a number of details. This event is also co-sponsored by KU International Affairs, the Dole Institute of Politics that is hosting us here tonight, and the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. Tonight, Ambassador Kyslytsya will be in conversation with Erik Scott, John P. Black Professor of History and Director of KU's Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies. The ambassador will also respond to questions from the audience, and we have a wonderful audience tonight, so we invite you to take active part in the conversation. And now it is my great pleasure and privilege to introduce our esteemed guest. Sergiy Kyslytsya is a Ukrainian career diplomat who serves as Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary of Ukraine and Permanent Representative of Ukraine to the United Nations. In this role, especially since the beginning of Russia's full-scale war against Ukraine, he has been a strong and fearless voice advocating for Ukraine and Ukrainians in their fight for a right to simply exist as an independent nation. He's been tirelessly refuting a constant barrage of lies about this war coming from Russia's representatives at the UN. Indeed, for Ukrainians like myself and many supporters of Ukraine around the world, his advocacy has been an inspiration. Before becoming ambassador, Mr. Kyslytsya served as Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine. And prior to that, he was the Director General for International Organizations within the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry. Ambassador Kyslytsya is a recipient of the Order of Merit of Ukraine, 3rd class, for, and I quote, significant personal contribution to strengthening international cooperation of Ukraine, many years of fruitful diplomatic activity and high professionalism. Mr. Kyslytsya graduated cum laude from Taras Shevchenko National University of Kyiv with a Master of Arts degree in International Law. And what is especially exciting for us tonight, he spent the academic year of 1992-1993 here in Lawrence, studying at the University of Kansas as an exchange student. Indeed, it is the ambassador's personal connection to KU and a wonderful case of happenstance involving one of my current students of Ukrainian that brought Ambassador Kyslytsya back to Lawrence. When this student, who is part of my intermediate Ukrainian online course, came to the meeting with the ambassador proudly bearing his Ukrainian textbook and other study materials and explained that he was taking Ukrainian online at KU, the ambassador shared that he too had once been a student at the University of Kansas. The initial connection was made there and then, of which all of us are the beneficiaries tonight. So please join me in extending a very warm welcome back to KU to His Excellency, Mr. Sergiy Kyslytsya.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much indeed. I'm beyond being thrilled and humbled to be back in Lawrence 31 years after I left Lawrence. So it's incredible. I mean, I've been thinking about that moment many, many times. I thought about that when I lived in Washington from 2001 to 2006. I was thinking about that when I was in Ukraine for 14 years. And I was thinking about that all the time I'm in New York City. I would like immediately to thank Maria Carlson. She probably made me ambassador after all. I mean, you would never guess, but in 1993, I decided to go back from Kansas to Ukraine because I wanted to join the Ukrainian Foreign Service at the very moment of incredible expansion when we became independent. And ever since I work for the government of Ukraine. My guess is that it was you and your team back in early 90s who told someone in Washington that you would not take other students unless they send you Ukrainian students. So that is why in 1992, 5 Ukrainian students arrived. Lawrence, 2 boys, 3 girls, one of them myself. I believe that I was particularly blessed to end up in the Midwest. I always knew that I would be a Foreign Service officer, and I always knew that East Coast, West Coast, and especially East Coast would be frequently visited. But to spend even if a short period of time, just a year, in Lawrence, Kansas, gave me a unique opportunity to understand the United States better than many of my colleagues, and not only in Ukraine, but also in Europe, who might have had a chance to study at Harvard or Yale or Princeton, very snobbish institutions. But they would never travel to Midwest to see how people live and what they do and how they think about it. I do remember very well how I went to Dodge City and I spent some time with very simple people there, and how genuinely they were interested in what was going on in Eastern and Central Europe in a very genuine way. They were not really corrupt, neither by the politics nor by money. You know, I enjoyed very much such courses I took as international conflict. Tragically, that was the course to take for me, you know. I had a fallout with my professor of US foreign policy. She didn't like my final paper. She said, "That's a very good final paper for my husband." Her husband was teaching international conflicts, Philip Schrott. Yeah, Deborah Gerner. She unfortunately died, I think, in 2006. She was very distinct. She was quite a personality, you know, but she didn't like me. She didn't like what I was saying about Eastern Europe. She'd never been there. And she believed that my views were very radical, very nationalistic. Anyway, that, by the way, escalated my decision to go back to Ukraine and to join the Ukrainian Foreign Service. So one of the best courses I took at Kansas was interpersonal communications in international multicultural organizations. So me working today in New York with 193 countries, that's the course that everyone must take. You know, so thank you. I mean, English course, I mean, it was not bad. It was probably only A I got, you know, but anyway, I'm very happy to be here, but to continue on a more serious note, I would like to read you one thing, and that is, it was on this day, sorry. I deeply appreciate this honor, especially as it is presented to me, the award. No awards for me, thank you. Presented to me on this day, the 60th anniversary of Ukrainian independence. It was on this day in 1918 that the proclamation of independence of Ukraine and the Ukrainian National Republic took place. Those were the words on January 22, 1978, by Senator Bob Dole. So imagine speaking about 60 years of Ukrainian independence back in 1978. That illustrates how Midwest, how the heartland of this country was able to produce great politicians of the national level who back in 1978, in the middle of the Cold War, believed that Ukraine was independent and that Ukraine should be independent. So being here tonight in the Bob Dole Institute is a particular additional honor for me. And I would like to thank everyone, be it Ukrainian Americans, be it American Americans, be it whoever, for making our independence possible. And for making our independence possible not only last century, but also today. Because today we fight for our independence and our freedom. Without the allies like the United States, we would not last that long. We would not surrender. Much more people would be killed. But we have strong allies. There are many speculations, both in the United States and on the other side of the Atlantic, of what will be the future policy of the new administration with respect to Ukraine, but not only with respect to Ukraine. And I believe that everyone who wants to make America great cannot allow Ukraine to be defeated. Because if Ukraine is defeated by our common enemies, you are not a great nation. And for you, it's not even about loving Ukraine, liking Ukraine, appreciating Ukraine. For you, it is a choice of being a great nation or not being a great nation. If Ukraine is defeated, the camp of your enemies will only consolidate. And it's not only North Korea, it's also Iran, other countries. So it is a chain reaction, right? And in today's world, you cannot isolate yourself. The history is very cyclical. I would advise some of you to refresh your memory and to read some of the statements made by Charles Lindbergh, the famous American pilot, who was also a member of America First Committee. And in one meeting in New York City before World War II, he spoke publicly and he said, no matter how much we help the United Kingdom will lose the war. They will lose it to Hitler. So you can take this speech and you can compare that to many speeches we hear today about no matter how much we help Ukraine, Ukraine will lose. The United Kingdom didn't lose. The United Kingdom, together with the Allies, did win. You know, Charles Lindbergh, he regretted his words. He was discharged from Air Force, and after Pearl Harbor, he changed his opinion, and he wanted to re-enroll. He wanted to go back to Air Force. He was not allowed. But do you really need Pearl Harbors of 21st century to understand that you will lose big time if Ukraine fails? No, you don't. Luckily, I have to warn you, I'm not dealing with Ukrainian-American bilateral relations. I'm ambassador to the United Nations. I'm not ambassador to Washington, D.C. I have my excellent colleague, Oksana Markarova, who is dealing with bilateral relations. And by the way, that is another interesting fact. that not only I have connection with Midwest. Oksana Markarova, our ambassador in Washington, D.C., she graduated from Indiana University, right? Our chair of the Foreign Policy Committee in the Parliament, he graduated from Iowa, I believe. So you see the contribution of Midwest to Ukrainian Foreign Service is quite substantial, and it should stay this way. Because the people of Midwest, people of heartland of this nation, elect national leadership. And people should have access to best education because they need to make informed decisions, including when they go to polling stations. So I'm very happy that I meet my friends in Kansas. I'm very happy to see Maria Carlson. I'm very happy to see Alan Holliman, who was one of my professors and person who helped me a lot when I was in Kansas. I'm very happy to meet Erik Scott. I'm very happy to meet Alexandra. I'm very happy that the Ukrainian language is taught at Kansas University, which is very important. It is very important not only for American business, because when the war is over, Ukraine will be a site for the major recovery projects, and it will be comparable to Marshall Plan after World War II. And then if you have foreign business, including American business, you really need people who speak Ukrainian, because that makes your business easier. Not only for that reason, but also for another important reason. In 1991, the intelligence services around the world failed to predict and inform their governments that the Soviet Union would disappear, and very rapidly so. We had President Bush who traveled to Ukraine a couple of weeks before independence, and he was giving a speech in the Ukrainian parliament, and the speech is now known as Chicken Kyiv speech, because he told Ukrainians, don't think about independence, the Soviet Union will be there forever, embrace it. Not his words, of course, but that was the essence of his speech. And then he left, and the Soviet Union disappeared, big time. And then entire Western world started panicking, because they were not ready. They were not ready to face the situation that who will take control of nuclear arsenal? Who will take control of the Soviet debt? We have to remember what happened when Bolsheviks took power in 1917, and the new Bolshevik government defaulted on the debt, and many investors lost billions, maybe trillions by today's numbers. The same thing happened in February 2022. The US intelligence service, the UK intelligence service, they were smart enough to inform the governments that the invasion of Ukraine was imminent. But they failed to inform the respective governments that Ukraine would not surrender. They informed the White House, Whitehall, that Ukraine will collapse in a matter of weeks at best, and that there was no need to help Ukraine because they will totally collapse, totally overwhelmed by Russia. And they were offering our president a lift. And there was this famous phrase, I don't really need a lift, I need weapons. They were advising the government to have a government in exile, many other things. But had they be able to inform their governments that Ukraine would not surrender, they would have contingency planning. They would have plans how to help Ukraine and how that help should roll out rapidly, right? And then we would probably have another situation right now in the front. Because you can't even compare today's Russian army with what the Russian army was when they rolled in Ukraine. Now they are learning on the go. It's untrue to say that the Russian government, the Russian army is not learning. But to conclude, why you need to study, why students need to study the Ukrainian language, because had they studied the Ukrainian language, they would not look at that part of the world, including Ukraine, exclusively through the Russian optics, through the optics of the Russian language, through the optics of the Russian textbooks, through the optics of the Russian press, through the optics of having conversations with the Russian counterparts. They would also have a chance to read the Ukrainian sources, the Polish sources, the Czech sources, the Lithuanian sources, and they would understand better the maturity of the nation of Ukraine. They would know that no matter what Putin says and all those Russian professors and politicians say about Ukraine, that Ukraine was already quite a mature nation by February 24, 2022. So thank you very much to all of you who promote Ukrainian language studies here at Lawrence. So now I'm all yours. I will try to answer your questions if I do know answers. If I don't know the answers, don't explain.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ambassador. It's such an honor to host you here upon your return to the University of Kansas after 3 decades. We do have a wonderful turnout tonight, and I do want to get to audience questions, but I also wanted to start things off. And I'll start with a question of my own, then we'll open things up. And we have Anna and Andriy are able to take questions. But Mr. Ambassador, I want to start by asking about your work at the United Nations. The United Nations is an extremely important organization. You represent Ukraine there. It's a central organization, but it's also been criticized as a bureaucratic organization and as an organization dominated by its Security Council. And so I'm wondering, as Ukraine's ambassador, how do you work to advance Ukraine's interests within the United Nations, and what strategies in particular have you found to respond to often false claims that are made by Russia and other states regarding the full-scale invasion of Ukraine?
Oh my God, it's kind of a question that I have to spend another semester here in answering.
That was by design.
Yeah,
yes.
Let's reduce it. Before I answer, I would like to ask the audience, does any one of you know when and where the United Nations was conceived? Who was that? All right, I give you this thing. I will ask my assistant to give you this. And by the way, that's a very interesting story behind it. That's a bracelet with Ukraine made by the Kenya's ambassadors in New York mother, back in Africa. So one day I got a call from the Kenyan colleague of mine, and he said, I have a bag of goodies for you, and his driver brought me this huge bag of Ukrainian bracelets. So can you imagine a woman in Kenya being so shocked with what was going on in Ukraine that she made all those things? You are right, Yalta. Well, the official version, of course, that it was in San Francisco. So to make Americans proud that it was that they are parents of the United Nations, and in fact they are parents, in a sense that the United Nations has a very mixed DNA of 2 gentlemen and 1 dictator. The US President and the UK Prime Minister, and the Soviet dictator Stalin, who indeed met in Yalta in 1945. And in their conversations very early, Stalin made it absolutely clear, I'm not going to allow anyone but victor states to decide the future global affairs. So the UK Prime Minister, who didn't have a chance to attend KU, but nevertheless, he got some education. He used a quote, a bit in a corrupt way, from a 16th century work of Shakespeare, Titus Andronicus. And he explained that to Stalin, and in fact, the US president really liked that explanation. He said, don't really care about little birds singing. Because in the original of the English of the 16th century, it was, the eagle suffers little birds to sing, right? Why? He was not probably using the original language, explaining that to Stalin, something maybe vulgarized version, but he said, the eagle can stint little birds at any moment with a shadow of his wing. So that was the message. We will design something where we will control everything, while others can play in the sandbox of the General Assembly. And we, the eagles, the American eagle, we will sit in the Security Council. And we will have the veto right. And we will decide about everything. And if they like, they can play in the sandbox and sing their little birds songs. So everybody liked it. Everybody in Yalta liked it. It was very important for the Americans as well, because the reason the United States never joined the League of Nations was because Woodrow Wilson invested incredible amount of time and political capital in the treaty. He sent it to the US Congress, and the US Congress said, no, we're not going to let you join something where we cannot control the decision-making process. So in Yalta, they decided, based on that history lesson as well, so they will control everything. So of course, then we all went to San Francisco. I say all, because Ukraine went to San Francisco. Ukraine had a separate from the Soviet Union delegation in San Francisco. It's another reason why, but it's a matter of fact that Ukraine had a separate delegation in San Francisco. I tell you more. One of the reasons Ukrainians were so angry with the United Nations in 2022 and even before, because it should be reminded that the war didn't start in 2022. The war started in 2014 when Russia invaded Crimea, tried illegally to annex it, and parts of eastern Ukraine. Why? Because it is a very known history fact that it was the head of the Ukrainian delegation in San Francisco who was the chair of the working group, because the countries were divided in different working groups, and they were working on different parts of the UN Charter. So the head of the Ukrainian delegation was the chair of the working group that worked on the initial part of the UN Charter that is called today the Purposes and Principles of the United Nations. And those were exactly the purposes and principles of the United Nations that were violated on the night of the full-scale invasion. And the Ukrainians were asking questions, what the hell? Another thing is that the full-scale invasion started in the month of February 2022. And it was the Russian Federation that was presiding the Security Council for the month of February. So it was not only that the UN Charter was brutally violated, literally raped, it was raped by the president of the Security Council. The body of the United Nations that, according to the Charter, is entrusted with the primary responsibility for international security. So for me, that was quite a challenge to explain to my citizens why and what I'm doing there in the Security Council if it is totally useless in the opinion of many, right? But I had to explain, both my colleagues in the government and the Ukrainian public, that the United Nations is not exclusively the Security Council. It has many pillars, including the sandbox of General Assembly, that by night of February 2022 had 193 countries, right? When the UN was formed, the Security Council was representing 22% of the membership of the United Nations. By now, it represents only 8% of the membership of the United Nations because the membership expanded. And we were very wise and very rapid in embracing the opportunities that the General Assembly would give us. We called the emergency session, and we managed to pass by now 7 resolutions through the General Assembly. Of course, the resolutions, they are of political nature, they're not legally binding, but they set up the framework that is by now very difficult to deviate from. Because one of the resolutions, for example, is the resolution about underlying principles of the UN Charter for just and lasting peace in Ukraine. And that resolution, if you compare it with the peace plan put forward by President Zelensky, they're almost identical. The only thing that the resolution does not contain is the direct reference to the peace plan. But today, when not many, but when some come up with alternative plans, we have this ability of referring them to the UN resolution. And we say 141 countries supported the underlying principle of the UN Charter as the basis for peace settlement in Ukraine. So if in your plan there is no territorial integrity, if in your plan there is no sovereignty, you go against not only Ukrainian position, but you go against the position of the General Assembly, even if it is a political, of political nature. All right?
Great.
Who's next?
Thank you very much. And we might have to invite you back at some point for the semester-long answer, but thank you for this very informative response. I do want to open things up now for questions. Since we have such a wonderfully large audience in attendance, please be brief in asking your questions. If you have a question, raise your hand. Anna and Andrei will take the microphone to you and then give them back the microphone when you're done with your question. So please raise your hand if you have a question. They will come to you.
I see the first volunteer here.
And Mr. Ambassador, you're welcome to sit or stand as you
Hello,
prefer.
my name is Murat Jalilov, and I have this one question. Do you think the fate of the UN is going to be the same as the League of Nations? You kind of mentioned that. Yeah, I know there's like differences between the two entities, but and I understand that the United Nations passes resolutions and has like a function, but my question is that, so for example, Antonio Guterres, like he visited like BRICS countries, and he's been kind of like wishy-washy on the whole situation with like when it comes to Ukraine, and not just Ukraine, and other conflicts in the world right now. So generally, I think that I'm asking like, what do you think the future of the UN looks like, and do we need a new organization at this point?
It's a very good question. It's very difficult to answer one way or another. It's not going to be black and white answer. But I will begin with telling you that it is in the interest of your enemies, our enemies and our opponents, that we withdraw from the United Nations. Our enemies and our opponents will be happy if Ukraine and other troublemakers will be out of the United Nations, because then the United Nations will stay. It will not disappear. Because the overwhelming majority of countries around the world, at least 170 countries, need the United Nations for their own reasons and purposes. So if we are out, thank you very much. No Ukrainian ambassador in the Security Council who grills the Russian ambassador and makes him answer difficult questions on the record, webcast all around the world. So the Russian propaganda will not be challenged, neither in the Security Council, nor in General Assembly, nor in ECOSOC. So the option to leave the United Nations doesn't help you. It will not help the US administration, be it Republican, be it Democratic. No. The League of Nations collapsed eventually, not only because of the deficiencies of the design, but because the US was never part of it from the very beginning. And we may not, but some may not like the United States. But you can't have a global institution without the United States. Be it the beginning of the last century, be it the beginning of this century. And not only because the United States pay 22% of the budget of the United Nations, regular budget, and 27%, yes, it's 27%, I think, to the peacekeeping operation budget. So you have 193 countries, and just one country pays almost a quarter of the budget. Not only because of that, but because the role that the United States as a nation plays and wants to play globally as a nuclear power, as the strongest economy around the world, You can't really be outside the system. That's why one of the first nominations by President-elect is the nomination of the future US representative to the United Nations, who is, by the way, almost always, US ambassador to the UN is almost always also the member of the cabinet, unlike many ambassadors, peer ambassadors in New York. So being a member of the cabinet allows you to sit in the meetings of the cabinet and to have a direct line of reporting and discussing it with the president. So, of course, many things are decided and channeled through the State Department and through the NSA, but being a member of the cabinet means that you can sit with the president and have this direct conversation. So no, I hope the United States will not leave the United Nations. I don't really see such a scenario, and especially because the United States has this particular privileged role of being a permanent member. And the Security Council it has total impasse only on one issue, and that is Ukraine. On all other issues, and there are more than 50 plus agenda items on the Security Council agenda. On all other issues, the Security Council manages to, even with the cesarean section sometimes, to take a decision, right? So for the United States, in my opinion, the platform of the United Nations, the platform of the Security Council will continue to be the primary international global platform to express the US position 24/7. You don't really need to call Putin or to call Lavrov to tell the Russians your position, because there is always the Russian ambassador sitting in front of you in the Security Council, and you can tell him on record what is the position in Washington, in addition to the conversation behind the scene. And then the world needs the United Nations, because the United Nations is not only security issues. The United Nations is the largest platform to deliver humanitarian assistance to many countries around the world. In 2022, when the war started, when the full-scale invasion started in Ukraine, if I'm not mistaken, there were about 48,000 Somalis who died of hunger. 48,000. Half of them were children. And if you look at the figures of the deliveries of food to many areas of the world by FAO, which is a Food and Agriculture Organization of the United States. There are many countries around the world that literally needs this assistance. And this assistance is not necessarily can be provided bilaterally, because you need platforms, you need mechanisms. There are many rich governments in Europe and wherever else who are not capable to send their stuff, but they can give money, and then the United Nations acts on the ground. There is also peacekeeping operations wing of the United Nations. Not as successful as it used to be. They are withdrawn from Mali, from other parts of Africa, but peacekeeping is very important. Not in Ukraine, and it's a separate conversation. So if you go and if you tell dozens of countries in the General Assembly, the UN is trash, they will tell you, no, it is not. We need the United Nations. If the United Nations is removed from this scene, our opponents and our enemies will immediately take this place. And there will be no framework of reference for the rules of engagement, for accountability, for transparency. And that is not what we want to do. There are countries that are very successful in helping Global South countries. They give money and food seemingly with no conditions, but the agenda is hidden, So I think that the future US policy in the United Nations will be very vocal, very robust. There will be probably announcements about financing certain parts of the United Nations, because speaking to the General Assembly, from what I remember, because I'm dealing with the United Nations for centuries, so I remember what people say. So when President Trump spoke to the General Assembly in 2018, among other things, he said that we have to reduce American contribution to the peacekeeping operation budgets to 25%. It's still 27, almost 27, But I don't see really the United Nations or any global organization without the meaningful and powerful engagement of the United States.
Thank you very much. We have a question in the back there.
Hi, I'm a 16-year-old high school student in Lawrence. I was wondering how Ukraine has planned for Trump has said that he was going to cut majority of funding to Ukraine. I was wondering how Ukraine is prepared for that and how you believe that will affect UN's funding to Ukraine.
It's not about your statement, but it's a general rule. Let us not cherry pick statements or quotes from the context, one thing. Another thing is that the world is more complex than headlines are. And by the way, that it's not the journalist, not the reporter who picks up the headline. The headlines are usually picked up by editors, and the headline may be totally misleading. There are many journalists and reporters who are so pissed off with the headlines, where they would say, we have never reported that, why we have this headline. Look, Ukraine always, at least under the current government, believed in bipartisan support, in the need of bipartisan support. So we were always engaging both with the Democratic and Republican Party. When President Zelensky was in the United States in September for the high-level week at the United Nations, he traveled to Washington from New York to meet with President Biden and the then candidate Kamala Harris. And then he came back to New York and he had a separate meeting with Trump. So we were not putting eggs in only one basket, as everybody would do, We will engage with this administration, and we will do our best to build up on the partnership that exists for many decades between our countries, no matter who was in the White House.
right? It's not the first Republican administration. It's not the last Republican administration. And I will tell you a secret, which is not a secret. Historically, and maybe Maria Carlson will support this argument, the Ukrainian Americans were voting Republican. I don't know how they voted this time, because it's a very unconventional situation. But historically, the Republican Party was very anti-Soviet, very anti-communism. So ideologically, those who were working and fighting for Ukrainian independence, they were closer to the ideals of the Republican Party. No prejudice to the Democratic Party. But it's also the matter of fact. And I'm not accusing anyone, but it's a matter of fact. Budapest Memorandum, prepared and signed under which administration? Democratic administration. Has it helped us? No. The answer is obvious. Crimea was invaded under which administration? Obama. No prejudice to Obama. Great person. Great politician. I'm serious. I'm not trolling anyone. But it's a matter of fact. It was invaded under Obama administration. And I remember very well, I was then the deputy foreign minister, and I remember very well how many governments, not only the American government, were telling us, that is the last piece of Ukrainian territory that Putin will take. Don't even think about fighting, right? We all know what happened in Munich 1938, when the UK and the French prime ministers met with Hitler, helped by the US president, who was writing to Hitler, encouraging him to go to Munich. And they were very happy that they reached a deal with Hitler, that they gave Hitler part of Czechoslovakia, who was not even present in Munich. And Chamberlain landed in London, and he said, addressing journalists at the airport, I brought you peace for generation. And that peace lasted less than 1 year. Invasion of 2022 happened under which administration? It doesn't mean that had it happened under the other administration, it would be a problem. No, history does not doesn't know conditionalities, only what would have happened. But without the democratic administration that is currently in power, we would not survive. Because it was this administration that eventually gave us things and money and weapons that allowed us to be where we are today. And we are still alive. More than 80% of territory of Ukraine is now occupied. The government of Ukraine is fully functional. The banking system of Ukraine is fully functional. And believe it or not, for wrong reasons, but the economy is growing. Right? It's another thing that the wartime economy is totally useless in peacetime. And one of the things I would like to tell you that the day the war is over, the Russian economy will collapse. Because Putin is so proud, and his propaganda machine is so actively spreading this information. We are growing. The salaries are higher. The economy is growing. But that is a very monstrous Frankenstein kind of economy that's totally useless for peacetime. So they will collapse immediately after peace. And that's basically one of many reasons why Putin is so clinging on waging this war. Because the end of the war will mean not only his political end, but also the economic collapse of the Russian economy.
Question right here.
Is it? Oh, yeah. Sure. Is it working?
Yes.
Sir, thank you very much for being here. And my question is about the need for security guarantees. A lot of experts agree, I don't know if you share that view, that this is an open question, that neither Democratic nor Republican administration are really discussing the need for security guarantees in the future for Ukraine. Дякую і слава Україні.
Героям слава. And the security guarantees were the issue from the very beginning of existence of independent Ukraine. In fact, the Budapest Memorandum was essentially about it. However, you won't find the word guarantees in the text of the Budapest Memorandum. Those were assurances, not guarantees. And that is not true when many Ukrainian, and not only Ukrainian politicians, refer to the Budapest Memorandum as if it was a set of guarantees. No, those were assurances. In fact, if you look into the declassified exchange of letters declassified by the US government several years ago, exchange of letters between President Clinton and President Yeltsin several months before Budapest Memorandum, you would see how little the Budapest Memorandum was about Ukraine in those letters. My professional analysis of those declassified letters, it was mostly about how to remove nuclear arsenals from the territory of Ukraine, but also about how to engage Russia. And how to engage Russia in particular that winter, how to make Russia come to the ministerial of NATO in December, the same year, right after Budapest. And the Russians were speaking in that exchange in the Russian language. They were using indeed the word guarantees, while the Americans were persisting in using assurances. The only true security guarantee for us is joining NATO. And even when we are inside NATO, Russia will continue for foreseeable future be an imminent threat to all of us. But that will be a very important thing that will make Russia think many, many times before they will strike again. And the tragic truth, in my opinion, is that if we finish this war wrong way, and wrong way means that the conflict is frozen, that the job is half done, half cooked, Russia will strike again maximum in 5 years from now. And then the price that the taxpayers in Europe and in the United States will pay will be even higher. Unless, of course, the United States will decide to pretend that another major war in Europe has nothing to do with American interests, and they will abandon the allies in Europe, which is the scenario I don't really envision, because that will be the end of the American intention to be great. Again, you can't be great if your allies are attacked in Europe and you do not help them. So when I'm asked in New York by my fellow ambassadors or by visiting politicians from Europe, and they ask me, what are the conditions that the Ukrainians would agree to stop the war? I immediately answer that kind of question with my question, and I would say, what will be the conditions for the French, for the British, for the Germans that they would agree to so that they wouldn't need, in 5 years from now, to engage in another war again? Would they allow the Ukrainians to finish the war in a manner that will keep your enemy super strong, that will allow your enemy to reform the army big time, to fire the generals and to hire generals, to replenish the stockpiles with weapons, munition, and then to hit again? So it is the same thing as you prescribe antibiotics, but the dosage is not strong enough. So what happens? The virus adjusts to the wrong dosage of antibiotic. And then no matter how strong is the next prescription, it's already adjusted virus. You cannot kill it. So that is the same about Russia. The problem with Russia is, in my opinion, is that even all of a sudden, for whatever reason, you don't have Putin there, and you have someone, a transitional government or a new leader, who will come to Washington or to New York and who will say, that's a new prime minister, that's a new Lavrov, that's a new defense minister, we are all new people, trust us. Will you trust them? How many times have we trusted Russians in the last 30 years? They're not trustworthy. Russia invaded Georgia in August 2008, 20% of the territory. What happened in the spring of 2009? Reset. The Americans and the Russians met in Geneva, pushed the button. We reset our relations as if nothing happened. What happened before that? Back in 1991, in December 1991, it's a very exciting conversation, very long one. The first instance of Russian occupation. There is a long list of Russian occupations. But the very first Russian occupation was the occupation, illegal occupation, bypassing all the rules and procedures of the permanent seat of the Soviet Union in the Security Council. I can tell you with all the papers I have in my hands today how it was done. With the help of the American lawyers. Because if you read the interview that the then Soviet ambassador, Voronkov, gave in 2015, the interview, he said, the Americans had very good lawyers, and they told us how to do that. Right? No vote in the Security Council on the membership, as required by the UN Charter. No vote in the General Assembly. Before Christmas, Yulia Voronkov has a nameplate, Soviet Union. People come back after Christmas, still December. Same Yulia Voronkov, nameplate Russian Federation. So when you let a country bypass all the rules at the very, very beginning of their independent existence, they appreciate their strengths. They believe they can do whatever they like, no matter what the UN Charter reads. 1995, 1996, Ukraine wanted to be admitted to the Council of Europe. Council of Europe is the most important European institution for human rights. It's a standard-setting institution. The Council of Europe told us, here is the list of things you have to do to qualify for the membership. And the government of Ukraine was working very hard to meet all the requirements. And then the Western European politicians said, oh, we can't really admit Ukraine without admitting Russia, or at least we have to make this period very short. So we implemented the list of requirements. They were about to invite us, and they invited us. What they did at the same time, they invited Russia to join the Council of Europe. In the middle of the Chechen War, of the Second Chechen War, they were killing the Russian citizens by thousands in Chechnya. And they were invited to the Council of Europe because Western European politicians believed it is expedient to have the Russians on board, even if they kill their own citizens. So this sequence of never-ending, closing eyes, forgiving, initial expression of concern, followed by resetting of relations, led the Russian Federation to a regime that believes that they are beyond reproach, that they can do everything, no matter what. But if you have a new government, new transitional government, and they will tell you, we are having democratic elections. Can you have democratic elections in a country that has no political parties, real political parties, no competition, no civil society, no free media? And those are the minimal requirements for democratic elections. You can't really have, you cannot order overnight, from Monday we have 5 political parties. From Tuesday we have absolutely independent judiciary. No, that will take ages for the Russian Federation to come back to where Russian Federation was at the beginning of the 90s and to start moving towards democracy. And that will take a good number of years. In the meantime, the Russian Federation will continue to be the imminent threat for Europe, an imminent threat for this planet. And it means that we would all need, whether we like Ukraine, whether we support Ukraine or not, we will all need to be strong. We will all need to have strong, reinvented military, and especially in Europe. One of the problems of Europe is that starting from late 80s until now, many Western Europeans grew to believe that their right to summer holidays is almost biblical. So no matter what happens around, we are entitled to summer holidays. So France leaves Paris after the parade on Bastille Day. Everybody goes south. Rome and every Italian business shuts on the 15th of August. Nothing happens. Please, no wars in Georgia. You know that the conflict prevention cell of the OSCE was on holidays for 2 weeks while there was already a war in Georgia. And then in 2 weeks they came back and it was all done by then. So one of the speeches I would like you to recommend to read is the speech by the ex-Prime Minister of the UK, Baroness Margaret Thatcher, that she delivered in Washington, D.C., at the American Enterprise Institution in March 1991. And she spoke, among other things, about how the US and the United Kingdom, in the middle of the 80s, last century, reinvented the defense strategy, reformed the armies. And by the end of the 80s, the socialist countries were not socialist anymore in Europe. And by early 90s, the Soviet Union collapsed. Because the Soviet Union could not sustain competition with Western countries if Western countries are serious about their security and defense. All right?
Thank you. Other questions? Yeah, over there in the corner. And Andrei will bring you a microphone.
I was wondering if you could please describe what it was like in the first 48 hours after the initial attack in 2022, February of 2022, from your perspective as an ambassador.
Right. The months of January and the months of February in New York, we spent most of the times in conversations, including linguistic, equilibristics, because the US administration was saying the invasion is imminent, the invasion is imminent, the invasion is imminent. And I even had to go to one of the press conferences with the thesaurus to explain to the Russians what imminent means. No, seriously. Humpty Dumpty, Lewis Carroll, Humpty Dumpty, Alice in the... Yeah, so Humpty Dumpty, Alice asks Humpty Dumpty, how can one word can have so many meanings? And Humpty Dumpty says, the word means what I want it to mean. And those were the Russians. Because if you look into the thesaurus, you see that imminent has different meanings. So they would use the most distant one, and they would say, no, you are hysterical if you say that the invasion is imminent. They were denying the possibility of invasion. You would see, if you go back and you pull out the records of the Security Council meetings, and you would have the Deputy Foreign Minister Vershinin, who would say, no, never. You are hysterical, he would say, that it would happen. The Secretary General was saying that it's not up to me to interfere. It's up to Washington and Moscow to decide, and I was not asked to interfere. It's another thing that we should give him credit. On the night of the invasion, he came out of Security Council and he made a very passionate plea to Putin to stop the war, and ever since then he was very determined when it comes to that position. So by lunchtime of February 23, we already knew that that will happen. So the foreign minister was in town because we had the discussions at the General Assembly. I wrote a letter to the Security Council and I called a meeting, an emergency meeting. Surprise, surprise, as I said, Russia was the president of the Security Council. So we all went to that meeting. The foreign minister had to leave because he was flying back to Ukraine already. And in the middle of the meeting, which was about 9 o'clock New York time, I received the news that the invasion started. So I told Nebenzia, grab your smartphone, go and call Lavrov, and ask him what was going on. I mean, later on in the BBC interview, he said, who the hell the Ukrainian ambassador was to tell me what to do and whom to call. The countries, the members of the Security Council that hadn't yet read their speeches, were continuing to read the speeches that were already redundant because they were pre-war speeches, And then we had a sequence of Security Council meetings right after the beginning of the invasion. It was apparent the Security Council was not able to take any decision. So then my government decided to call the emergency session of the General Assembly. And the overwhelming majority of the UN members were so disgusted with what was going on. There was a speech of Martin Kimani, who was then the permanent representative of Kenya. And that is an iconic speech from an African ambassador that set the Kenyan policy for years to come. And he spoke about the inviolability of the borders in Africa. And he said, we got those borders from colonial times. Those borders are wrong. but we cannot afford starting wars to change the borders. So now we have to go to Security Council almost every other week. We already had more than 130 meetings of the Security Council. And one may say, why the hell you continue to do that? And my reply is that, well, first of all, that is the only place on planet Earth where, whether he likes it or not, the Russian ambassador must come to the meeting as a permanent member. He usually comes and then he runs away before I take the floor. And I always kind of grill him because I know how to tell him that he is not a good person if he runs away, and even less a good person if he stays, right? So he's always in this kind of catch-22. He doesn't know really what's worse, to stay or to go, to stay or to go, you know. But otherwise, Ukraine would not have a chance to grill the official Russian representative, right? And you don't forget that this grilling is televised all around the world, probably with the exception of North Korea, and I don't know what's going on in Russia, whether they are allowed to look into the proceedings. And that is also, those discussions are going on record. And those discussions, the same like in Nuremberg after World War II, will be part of the proceedings of the future tribunal for war crimes. I mean, the Nazi diplomats, including von Ribbentrop, they were trying to play idiots in Nuremberg. Oh, we didn't know what happened. We were implementing orders. You know, but when you listen to what Nebenzia and his minions say in the Security Council, and they say that on record, they're just helping us and all the lawyers of the victims of this war to prepare their statements in the future tribunals, you know. All right, who else?
I'll take a couple of questions now. Right here, and then I'll take Matvey in the back.
Right now, there's another country that is facing a situation similar to what Ukraine faced, and that is Taiwan. And we have the Chinese saying that Taiwan has never existed as an independent country, and it belongs to us. I was wondering, since the situation is quite similar in that Putin also claimed that, you know, Ukraine never existed as an independent entity and was Russian. There are different instruments of national power. You've got economic, political, military, informational. What about using, has Ukraine thought about using the, I guess, the political diplomatic instrument of national power and just telling China, hey, you have been designated by NATO as a decisive enabler for the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Maybe it's time for us to recognize Taiwan and establish full diplomatic relations with Taiwan. And I think if the other Eastern European countries did the same, China might reconsider its support for Russia.
China is an important country. China is a permanent member of the Security Council. China has a set of unique leverages that should the government in Beijing decide, they can apply on Moscow and to influence Moscow's decisions. China benefits from the current situation of weakness of Russia. Putin, whether he likes it or not, he's de facto a servant of China. Never in the history, in my opinion, there was any leader of Imperial Russia or the Soviet Union or the Russian Federation who would be so willing to do so many things that wouldn't be even imaginable several years ago. I think it was 2 years ago that one of the ministries, one of the government's agencies in Beijing decided, and you can find that on their website, that they should return the Chinese names to certain parts of the Russian Federation that belonged to China before. So even Vladivostok is not Vladivostok anymore in China. It has some Chinese name, right? Have you ever heard about protestations from Zakharova, this spokesperson for Lavrov, or from Peskov? So we try to do our best to talk to the Chinese government. Only this year, our first deputy minister traveled to Beijing. We had political consultations. Then the foreign minister of Ukraine traveled to China. We had a visit. Then during the high-level week in New York, we had a very long meeting with our foreign minister and head of the administration with Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, and we must talk to them. And we do talk to them. And we hope that we will find a way how to develop this engagement. If you look at Taiwan, I'm not going to speak a lot about Taiwan because Ukraine has the policy of recognizing only one China. The nature of relationship between the United States and Taiwan is different from the nature of relationship between the United States and Ukraine. The legal base is different, unfortunately. But China is an important player, and all governments need to talk to China. That's why one of the first conversations, I believe, between elected president of the United States and foreign leaders was the conversation with Xi Jinping. All right. Who's next?
Question in the back there.
Thank you for being here, Ambassador. I have a two-part question on legitimacy. So first, how does Ukraine counter Russian propaganda stating that since Ukraine's president 5-year term elapsed without new elections, he is not legitimate anymore? And second, what is your opinion on how other countries like United States should treat dealing with Russia? Because on one hand, any dealing with Russia gives Russian government more legitimacy, which is bad. But on the other hand, there are important things which needs to be talked with Russia, like space or prisoner exchanges or other important things. So in your opinion, how should this be approached?
What exactly, the second part, what exactly should be approached?
Like, well, how governments should approach dealing with Russia to solve the needs, but not granting it more legitimacy than it already has.
Look, you need to bring Putin's people to Kansas, and they have to study. And then they will realize that cherry picking from a national legal framework is only for idiots. Seriously. It's not only in the United Kingdom that didn't have elections for many years during World War II, because you cannot have elections when the country is in the state of war. When was the first election in the UK after the end of the war in May? In July 1945, right? Anyone had doubts that the Prime Minister of the UK was the legitimate Prime Minister? The same is in Ukraine. The Constitution of Ukraine does not allow to have elections when there is a state of war. Because the elections during the state of war will be fraud. You can't have democratic elections when there are limitations on political parties' activities, on media. You cannot have elections in the temporarily occupied territories. You cannot have elections when you have millions of Ukrainians living abroad. You know? So the law specifically says, the Constitution of Ukraine says, no elections during the state of war. When the state of war is canceled, the nation will start preparing for the elections, and they cannot be held overnight. It will be a process of preparing, because if you want to have democratic elections, you have everything be operational. And in one of the Security Council meetings, I had to lecture Nebenzia about the Ukrainian legal framework. I regretted that his major was international economics, and especially international economics of the Soviet vintage. It was not even the normal international economics, you know, but it is a very simple legal issue. Engagement with the Russian government and the Russian officials is a very tricky question. Well, to begin with, the US government, many governments have a direct access, and I already mentioned that, to the Russian ambassador in New York, 24/7. And you don't really need, if you decide to call Lavrov or to call Putin, you need to explain to your government, to your parliament, to the US Congress, to experts, to journalists, why the hell you call him. But to talk to Nebenzia, you don't really need to do that because you meet him regularly, right? There is also, as you know, it's not a state secret, there is this interaction between intelligence services. There is also interaction of defense ministries, and the Secretary of Defense of the United States also had several conversations with his Russian counterparts. But the fundamental problem is Russia is not a democracy. In Russia, everything is decided just by one person. And no matter how you engage with his entourage, they are not able to deliver on whatever they promise, on whatever they say, unless Putin agrees to that, you know? And Putin seems to be living in a very artificial world, very, very affected by COVID. I mean, it's not a joke, because he spent the COVID period in a very deep seclusion, in addition to his habit not to use internet, not to use open sources of information, you know. After the first summit peace summit in Bürgenstock in Switzerland, there were several statements by the Ukrainian government that we can envisage the Russian participation in the second summit should Russia agree to the peace framework that with more than 100 countries we develop after Bürgenstock. But all we hear is that, no, we're not going to be there, the Russians say. Guterres travels to Kazan. Guterres had a meeting which was totally disastrous for the image of the United Nations. He had a meeting with Putin. Have we heard some practical deliverables from that meeting? No, I didn't. A Chinese journalist, not a European one, not an American journalist, in one of the noon meetings after Kazan, he asks the spokesperson for the Secretary General, he says, there are many rumors about North Korean deployment. Can you tell us, since it is a security issue, had the Secretary General discussed it with Putin? The spokesperson says, No, he hadn't. I was shocked. I was shocked because I don't expect the spokesperson for the Secretary General to lie about what was discussed, what was not discussed. But it didn't help the Secretary General to recover from that absolutely disastrous, from the perception of all Ukrainians and many Europeans, that meeting with Putin and the whole pictures and videos coming from it, you know. So eventually, I can hypothetically see Russians sitting in a peace conference. But the Russians should be ready, in my opinion, to be there with full respect of the UN Charter. It's a very banal statement. It's a very banal statement. But if you do not respect the UN Charter, you do not respect territorial integrity. You do not respect sovereignty. It's another thing, again, once again, Humpty Dumpty thing. That the word can mean whatever you want it to mean, not what it means. There are statements by the Russians, including in the United Nations, who say, we are for territorial integrity of Ukraine. But when they say that, they mean that we have to recognize the territorial grabs, new reality, so to say, and that Ukrainians have to forget about part of Lugansk, part of Donetsk region, about Crimea. Otherwise, we are for territorial integrity. You know? So, but the problem is, for him, while it is our advantage, that Ukraine, with all the deficiencies, is a democratic state where national leaders are so dependent on constituents that it is very difficult to imagine that territorial concessions can help a national politician to survive. That politician can be easily removed, if not through the elections, then in other ways from the offices. I mean, and the more Ukrainians are killed, contrary to the Putin's logic, the more Ukrainians believe that if we lost our brothers, our fathers, our nephews, those losses should not be for nothing. Because we didn't fight so many years just to give up our territory. And that is another reason why in Ukraine, where we have vibrant political life right now, the conditions of the peace cannot be enforced from the outside. And in fact, that's kind of a danger, because if someone tries to enforce the conditions, that may destabilize the situation in Ukraine. And destabilization of the situation in Ukraine will weaken our ability to fight. And that is in the interest of Putin. You know? So that is why our true allies, among other considerations, should not allow the political situation in Ukraine to destabilize. Because then it will be going to be very difficult to have a strong army. We need 5 Ukrainians to work to maintain financially one Ukrainian soldier. Because the money that the West gives to us, unlike what many Americans and Europeans believe, the money is not used to pay the soldiers. It's forbidden. The money is used for supply of weapons. The money is used for civil economic needs, but not to buy the soldiers, not to pay their salaries, not to, you know, we need money of our own economy to finance the army. And 90% of the money that is given by the United States for military assistance never leaves the United States. Never. The money goes to the Midwest, by the way. And I have in my office a map and infographics where I see how every single state in the heartland of this country, if not benefits, then gets all those multi-billion orders to produce weapon systems. Which means what? Jobs, mortgages, health insurance, being able to send your kids to Kansas University, and buying a modern weapon system from the United States makes you dependent on the United States for many years to come, because it means maintenance, software, spare parts, which in its turn means more jobs, more business activity. Central and Eastern Europe at the beginning of the war got rid of the Soviet-made weapon system that they used to have even until now, being formerly part of the military bloc of the Soviet Union. They dumped that on Ukraine. Thank you very much. That was useful, by the way. So now they have to buy American systems. So it's not only Ukraine that sends orders to the United States, to Midwest. It's also many European countries. So it's a very, I shouldn't really talk about that because it's responsibility of my colleague in Washington, D.C., but I mean, what is the percentage of the US budget dedicated to Ukraine? And I'm not even speaking about the US government budget. I'm speaking just about the budget of the Department of Defense. Less than 1%, 0.3. All right? Do you know how much money this country loses because people continue to smoke tobacco? No, seriously, I mean, it's not a joke. In 2022 or 2021, this country was losing almost 5% of the GDP, not 5% of the budget of the state of the Defense Department. 5% of the GDP because people smoke tobacco. So smoking kills you. Helping Ukraine saves your life. Literally, because you don't really need to send American soldiers. You don't really need to send American soldiers to Europe to fight and to die in Europe. So there are many ways to explain these things. And that is one of the reasons why I'm here today. Far away from New York, which is my primary responsibility. There is a lot of misinformation. There is a lot of fake news. But I've been asked many times in the course of the last 2 days, what is the role of Kansas University? What is the role of us? And I say, your role, and I think I already mentioned that, is to educate people. Not to indoctrinate people of Kansas, in this case, but to educate people. Your role as an institution is to give opportunities to learn, to draw your own conclusions from a very reliable sources of information. Right? It's not your role to tell people what to believe in, but it's your responsibility to tell them, here are the reliable sources, even competing sources, but you also have to teach people how to operate in today's environment, because social media totally ruins ability of people to think critically. You know, I remember times when I joined the Foreign Service, and I remember that old gentleman in charge of the United Nations, and he would remember how the Ukrainian delegation would travel to New York from Odessa on a cruise liner to New York. What a wonderful time. You know, tons of brandy, you know, cigars, reading newspapers, academic journals. Then you arrive to New York, you spend there half a year, and then you travel back, you write your report. You know, these days, it used to be, I would fly from Europe to New York, and I would have like 7 hours of freedom. But with the advancement of Wi-Fi, you are reached even on board of your aircraft. And the volume of information that you are being bombarded with, even for professionals, is totally overwhelming. You can't even really follow all the information that you receive, whether you like it or not, let alone absolutely wonderful people in western part of Kansas who work very hard every day, raising cattle or sunflowers or corn, whatever. They are very nice, hard-working people. It's not their duty to follow international news. They have the right not to follow it. But by the end of the day, they go to polling stations and they vote. So it is the duty of the government to give these people opportunity how to learn the truth, and not the Russian version of things that are happening around the world.
Thank you. Well,
Right?
we are unfortunately out of time here, but I think you know, the fact that we have a full room here, a standing room only, shows the extent of interest that our community has in Ukraine. And I want to thank Ambassador Kyslytsya for coming back here to the University of Kansas, and I hope it won't be another 30 years before you come back again. But thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Well, thank you all. Thank you.